Hi, everybody. You're probably wondering what can you do to make your WLAN controllers a little bit more resilient, more redundant, right? Without having to be limited by the physical limitations of the Cisco WLAN controllers. Well, Cisco has released the new iOS XE based WLAN controllers. While there are physical versions of that WLAN controller, what's more noticeable is that there is a Cisco 9800 WLAN controller for the cloud, which means you can install that on AWS, possibly Azure or any other cloud, but also means we can install this controller in our VMware ESXi environments. And so that's what this video is going to show you is how to install that in ESXi. And so the first thing that we have to do here is really download the controller. And so what we're going to use is the OVA file from cisco.com. So here you can see the link that I'm using, but I'll have that link down below in the show notes so you can download this as well. But here you'll find that the suggested release is Gibraltar 6.11.1c, which is just based on this recording at the time. And you scroll down here and you could find the OVA file. That is the file that we're going to need to import into VMware ESXi. And so go ahead and download that file and save it to your desktop. You do need a login to download this file. You just need to create what's called a CCO account and then search for the 9800CL. So before we get into that, this is an OVA file. An OVA file is something you use to import into VMware. And because I don't have vCenter, I'm using VMware ESXi, which, if you're interested, VMware ESXi for me in my lab is installed on an Intel NUC. It's an i7 with 32 gigabytes of RAM. So in order for us to import this OVA file without using vCenter, because I don't have the license to run vCenter, we're going to use something called the OVF tool from VMware. So here's another link you should keep track of right up here at the top. I'll also include this down in the description of the video. And so you just download the Open Virtual Format tool that is correct for your operating system. In this case, I'm using Mac OS X. And before we start importing this OVA file, I wanted to show you what my VMware environment looks like. So you can see here as I zoom in just a little bit, I'm using version 6.7.0. Currently, these are the virtual machines I have installed. You can see that I have deployed the Catalyst 9800 previously. And this is where the OVA file is going to deploy the controller. But prior to that, I do have some networking already set up. So here I have 4 networks. We're really going to use 3 because 2 of these are on the same VLAN. And so we're going to attach this network here, infra, lab wireless, and VM network. So you can see that they are VLAN 140, 120. And the one that's labeled VLAN 4095 is really my trunk port. So that's what I'm using to trunk to my controller. And so what are we going to do next? Now we're going to take the OVA file after it's been downloaded. I have it saved to my desktop. And we're now going to take that file and import it using the OVF tool into my VMware ESXi environment. So we head out here to my command line interface. The first thing you're going to need to do, I'm going to try to run through this a little quick, but I will have a blog post and a link to where you can find what to put into this file. But we're first going to create the OVF tool file, and this is the format you need to put it in. So I'm using VI here, so vi.ovf tool. And I've already created this file ahead of time. So these are the contents of the file. We're going to accept all EULAs. This is a data store in which I'm putting the VM into. And the deployment option. Now, this is an interesting line because this has to be with the type of VM that you're deploying, right? What is the scale of your WLAN controller? And so there's three different kinds. You have your 4 CPU, 8 CPU, or no, 6 CPU and 10 CPU. So that's a small, medium, and large deployment. And just in this lab scenario, because I have an Intel NUC, I don't have a really powerful VMware host. I'm going to pick the 4 virtual CPU version with 8 gigabytes of RAM. So that's what that means here. And so if you go back to the file, there's the deployment option for CPU, 8 gigabytes. That just means I can support about a max 1,000 access points and 10,000 clients that are supported. And so that's going to be a pretty big VM and WLAN controller already. And if you're wondering if this supports vMotion, VNet teaming, not yet. Maybe coming into a future version of the controller. So here is the name that I'm giving my WLAN controller. And remember, I showed you those three networks. These are the networks that I'm basically binding to these Ethernet, gigabit Ethernet interfaces of the WLAN controller. And here's the host name that I want to give it. And so what we do next is we actually run the OVF tool, which is going to call out to this OVA file I have on my desktop and use this OVF tool file to import that into VMware. So let's take a look at that. I already have the command written out here. So we're going to run the OVF tool, which is in my applications folder from when I installed it. And then I'm going to say you're going to import this OVA file right here. And so I'm using the 16.10 version. And then we're going to tell it to log in as root on this VMware server. That is the IP address of my VMware host. So we go ahead and hit enter here, and it's going to open the OVA source, the actual file we downloaded, and then it's going to ask me for my password for the root login. And so I'm going to type that in there if I can remember what that is. So there we go. It's opening the connection to VMware now. And so now it's going to deploy the actual OVA template. It's going to import it, and you're going to see that disk progress is going to start increasing. So if we go back to the VMware host here, let's go down to virtual machines. We're going to see that there is this new VM that's being deployed, lab-9800 WLC. That is the name that I gave that VMware host, the VM. And you can see here's the import vApp down at the bottom, and it's still progressing there. So we're going to wait until this import process completes, and then we will move forward into the actual configuration of the WLAN controller. So there we go. It is now complete. The transfer is there. There are no errors. If we go back to my VMware screen, you can tell it is complete there. So what we're going to do now is start this virtual machine, and then we're going to console into it via the built-in console of VMware. So let's go ahead and do that and see what we get. So we'll power that on there. I'll click on console here at the top, and I'll just open it in a browser window here. So this is a console directly through the browser, and we can see that the WLAN controller is booting up. It's asking to press any key to continue. If you don't, it'll just continue to do the boot process. So we'll wait for the controller to boot up here. So as this controller is booting up, I do want to talk about why you would want to deploy a controller in a cloud or virtual environment. Well, the new ESXi based WLAN controller does come with a lot of features, very similar to the physical version of these controllers. Now, it's not 100% feature parity, but it's pretty darn close. And so here it is. We're going to boot off of an image here. So what I find really interesting here is you don't have to maintain physical controllers anymore with this deployment. A lot of environments are not that complex when it comes to wireless, but they do need some of those advanced features, and this gets you there with the features you need if you're used to the Cisco WLAN controller. Now, this is different from what we're used to with Cisco controllers, where they're AirOS based. This one is iOS XE based. If you've ever used iOS before, and I'm sure you have, when you're using a Cisco switch, for example, or a Cisco router, the controller in the cloud gives us that more resilience, right? More of high availability because of the cloud environment. And since everyone's moving off to the cloud, this is where we want to put everything, right? All your servers are going to be in infrastructure that you can control in a better fashion, right? With backups, with redundancy, moving VMs to new environments. So if this controller needed more power, more resources, you can easily give it more resources, right? We deployed it in a small scale. Maybe that means you can move it to a medium scale when you get there. Or if you think of having it in the cloud, then you don't have to maintain those resources in the cloud any longer, right? A different team handles that. Somebody else's computer is what you're running it on, and you don't have to deal with physical infrastructure. So let's go back here to the installation, because now we're getting the system configuration dialog here. So now if we hit enter, we're going to get the would you like to enter the initial configuration dialog. This is a very familiar setup if you're used to configuring Cisco routers and switches. And so I do not want to go into initial configuration. And so here we're starting to go into the actual configuration of the controller itself. So yes, we are going to terminate the auto install. If whatever you see in the bracket there is the default. And so now we're going to get started here. A lot more log messages are going to show up. And you see this WLC prompt here, right? And let me see if I can zoom in just a little bit so you guys have well, I'm in console mode. Let me try to zoom in here. All right. Hopefully you guys can see that a little bit better. So now we're going to go into the configuration of the controller itself. We're going to hit enable, right? And then config T. I'm sure you guys are familiar with that. And we're going to go into the first interface here. Now, what we're going to hit is no switch port, and we're going to assign an IP address to this port here. This is an IP I have available on my infrastructure, and I just want to confirm that, right? So let's see here. I want to make sure that, yep, there is no other host on that using that IP address. And I do want to keep that running so we can check up on that later. Now, even though the interface is up, as you can see that I've configured an IP address, but I'm still not able to ping the controller. And that's because we have to add a gateway. So this is like a router, guys. So we're going to configure the gateway here. And so hopefully that gives us connectivity. And there it is. So I can ping the actual controller now, the virtual controller. But we're not done yet. We're going to set up a user account. I'm going to call it admin, give it a privilege of 15, and I'm going to give it a super secret password, right? You would use a stronger password in your environment. This is just a lab. So we're going to configure that there. And now what I want to do is actually try to see if I can log into the controller and do what's called a 0-day provisioning. I'll cancel that ping because I don't need that. So let's try to get there. We'll go to the IP address that I gave it. Oh, and we get this potential security risk, right? Because the certificate is not trusted. So we'll just accept that risk and continue. So there we go. We now have the login screen, right? From this login screen, we can use the credentials that I have configured with password 1234 as the password. I'm not going to save this right now with my one password. I don't need to. All right, I finally got to log in here and get rid of this password issue that I was having. I don't know what I was doing, typing it in wrong. But now, once I've logged in here with this configuration setup, we're going to go through the 0-day configuration. And so your deployment mode, here are your options. You got a standalone, active, or standby. So these bottom two would be if you've got redundant controllers, but we're only installing this single instance. So you properly select your country code, put in your date and time zone if you have any NTP servers. So I'll just type this in here. My NTP server is at my gateway. If we scroll down here, we'll now see some more settings that we can configure for this controller. And so here is where I'm going to select my wireless management settings. So this was the second interface that we had configured previously. And I'm going to say what VLAN it's on, right? So this is the interface for managing the actual controller. And so now I'm going to set a IP address for my controller here. Make sure I type that in properly. There we go. And we make sure you want to set up a gateway as well. And there we go. We don't need to set up a management VLAN DHCP server at the moment. So what I'm going to do is click next. And here we're going to configure our wireless networks. So here we can add a few, and I'll just call this guest, and we'll say this is a guest network type. I can do a web auth or auth bypass, whatever you want to set up here. We'll just add that in there. Then we'll add a network here. I'll call it CTS for the Clear to Send podcast. And you can select your WPA2 Enterprise or your WPA2 Personal. Here, we're just going to use Personal, and I'm going to call this just San Jose. All right, that's my password, my super secure password, pre-shared key. We'll go now. It doesn't like that because I didn't add the right length. Okay, so we'll just type something in there that will make sense. And we'll hit add. There you go. We've got two wireless networks. Okay, so now we're going to hit next if you're done configuring all the wireless networks you need. Now, this is just your configuration setup, so you can go back into here and configure everything you need. You don't even have to set this up in this configuration wizard. Once you fully configure the controller, you can actually get in there and configure everything you need. So now we're here with some advanced settings. And some of the things I would change here is the RF group name, right? So I'm going to call that CTS for clear to send. This is our traffic type. And the virtual IP address, you're going to want to select one that is not used. And also it is a private IP address. You don't want to use 1.1.1.1. The reason why is that 1.1.1.1 is now a public routable IP address. So please do not use that IP address for your virtual IP address in your WLAN controllers. All right, so we come down here to AP certificate, and you will want to make sure this says yes for generate certificate. And the reason is that this self-signed certificate of the controller is going to be needed so that an AP can join or associate to this WLAN controller. Select your key size. I'd suggest selecting a stronger one. You can set up your password here. I'll just type something in just to keep this going. Then you click on summary and you can review the settings that you've configured, right? Make sure everything is correct here. Otherwise, you can go back and configure everything again, but you do want to make sure your management settings are correct so you can get into your controller. So we're going to hit finish here. And do you know what's going to happen at this point? It is actually going to apply the configuration and we'll be logged out and be asked to log back in. So we'll click on yes, and we'll wait for that to complete. Once that configuration is applied, the WLAN controller is going to act like any other physical WLAN controller, other than the only difference is that it's now a virtual WLAN controller that we have running in VMware ESXi. So we have all the benefits of running a virtual machine, other than some of the limitations that Cisco has put on us, like we can't do vMotion yet. I'm pretty sure that'll come down in a future release. I sure hope so, because that's some of the benefits we'll want to use when we're using the virtual machine in VMware, right? So here we are logged out of the controller now. So we'll log back in and hopefully I'll get my password correct here. And I will not because I have a poor memory. So there we go. We're logging into the controller and there it is, guys. We have successfully installed a WLAN controller, the iOS XC version on VMware ESXi. So now here you can do a lot more configuration, configure everything you want here with a controller. You can monitor everything on this controller. It almost looks like a router, to be honest, because you're running iOS XC underneath. But you also have the command line interface. We have, oh, I was trying to click on licensing here to see what kind of license we have. And you're going to use this trial version. You do want to install the correct license. As you can see, I have no licenses in use, or you can go ahead and register this automatically. So hopefully that wasn't too complex of an installation. I think the hardest part was just using the OVF tool, which was command line based. And then that imports the OVA into VMware ESXi. Then that's when you go into VMware ESXi, launch the console, and configure your basic settings for your WLAN controller so you can access the management interface of your WLAN controller.